So we have looked at human rights for children. We have looked at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights for the whole world. What we're going to look at now is how human rights are implemented in the UK. So to start with, there is a quiz coming up. Press pause and see if you can answer them before the answers appear. Press pause and have a go. And there's your answers. See how many you got right. Okay, so where human rights actually originated from then, we can go all the way back to Jesus being born. Even if you are not Christian, I'm not a Christian myself, you don't need to believe that Jesus Christ was God's son to believe that actually Jesus did kind of preach about things that we associate with human rights. So again, this is not religious education. This is not teaching you Jesus is God's son. This is teaching you that Jesus was a human being who preached about things like morality, tolerance, justice, forgiveness and love, which are the essential kind of basis of human rights. Then we can move a bit further forward to about 600 and so, and we've got the Prophet Muhammad. Again, this isn't religious education. Muhammad did exist, Jesus did exist. Just because you might not believe in the religious side of them, there were actually people. So Muhammad again taught about equality, justice and compassion. Our next big thing then, and this can really be seen as the first document of human rights, is something called the Magna Carta. You will have studied this in history in Key Stage 3. So basically, the Magna Carta was a list of demands to King John. King John was not a very good king. He lost the crown jewels. He lost lots of land in battles. He treated the people very, very unfairly. So the nobleman demanded some changes, and basically he had to agree and sign to the Magna Carta. It challenged the monarch's power and it aimed to protect people's rights. So the king should no longer have freedom to punish any individual except through law of the land. In 1689, we then get something called the Bill of Rights, which again limited the power of the monarch, the king or queen, and set out rights for all Englishmen, including the freedom to petition without retribution, which is a really important part of living in a democracy. So we then came together, like we saw last lesson, after the Holocaust to make the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from the United Nations, the UN. So we got the UDHR, and that was 1948. That had 30 rights or articles that every human across the entire world needs to grow and flourish. And the impact of it, we developed human rights laws all around the world. So human rights belong to everyone. They're expressed in internationally agreed laws, and they are based on core values of fairness, respect, equality, dignity and autonomy. The first internationally agreed statement of human rights was the UDHR of 1948. And it's the starting point for all modern human rights laws. The next layer we get after that, so in the blue circle, we've got the global United Nations UDHR. We then get the kind of continent European wide one, which is the Council of Europe, and they released the European Convention of Human Rights in 1950. So we get 1948, the UDHR, 1950, the ECHR. We then get the UK's own version called the Human Rights Act of 1998 that came into effect in 2000, and that put all human rights into law in the UK. So the Human Rights Act and the European Convention. The Human Rights Act came into force on the 2nd of October 2000. It brings most of the rights contained in the ECHR into UK law. UK lawyers and civil servants helped to draft it, and it was agreed in 1950 by the Council of Europe, and the UK signed the convention in 1951. So in the UK, the Human Rights Act places all public authorities in the UK, such as NHS trusts, local authorities, that's councils, and central government departments, under a duty to respect the rights it contains in everything they do. What it means is that the Human Rights Act makes it possible for individuals to bring human rights cases in ordinary UK courts and tribunals. Before this happened, you had to go to the European Court of Human Rights, which is where you'd go if you got you felt your human rights were being violated. You can now do it in UK courts. You can still take it to the European Court, but you don't have to. Okay, so if we have a look here, then the development of human rights in the UK. We've got things like the 1998 Human Rights Act, we've got the European Convention of Human Rights, the Bill of Rights, Magna Carta. We've then got a few others then. So we've got 2010 Equality Act. We have looked at this before, but in 2010 a law was put together in the UK that places all forms of discrimination in one act, in one law. We've also got the Data Protection Act and so on and so forth. Okay, so you have got a 1 mark question on the board. If you press pause and have a go at answering it. And the answer is the European Convention on Human Rights. Okay, there are times though when the Human Rights Act disagrees with European rules. For example, we are supposed to allow prisoners to vote. We looked at this in the last module. Europe have told the UK that we are going against human rights laws by not allowing prisoners to vote. However, the UK government said, we don't care, we're not letting them vote, and that was basically it. There's also the issues about deporting terrorists or suspected terrorists to countries where they might be at risk or where evidence has been obtained by torture. So, for example, if we have a look at this one, we've got the case of Abu Qatada, and the European Court of Human Rights ruled that the authorities can't, in the UK, can't deport him to Jordan, which is where his home country is, because the evidence that was gathered against him is likely to be obtained by torture. The court ruled that this would amount to a breach of Article 6 of the Convention of Human Rights because torture was used to gain the evidence. So the Strasbourg court overruled a decision by the House of Lords, and after receiving further diplomatic assurances from Jordan, the government are making renewed legal efforts to deport Abu Qatada. So have a look at the questions, try and answer them, press pause and have a go. The other thing with human rights is that some are absolute, which means you can never have them taken away, and some are not. So, for example, the right not to be tortured or treated in an inhumane or degrading way, the right to liberty, and the right to respect for family life. One of those is absolute, 2 of them are not. Try and think which is which. Right, so the right to torture is absolute. You should never have that taken away. The right to liberty isn't. You can have it taken away if you need to be put into prison. And the right to respect for family life and privacy, that might be taken away as well. For example, if the police are launching an investigation against you, they might need to check your mail or your emails and search your home. You might be taken away from your family if you are a child and your family can't care for you properly, and placed in care and so on. So absolute rights then, there are a very small number of human rights that cannot be balanced against the rights of others or the wider community. They're absolute rights. They can never be limited or restricted, whatever the circumstances are, even in the event of a war or an emergency. There's only a very few of them. For example, not to be tortured. It's never okay to torture someone or treat them in an inhuman or degrading way, regardless of the circumstances. Non-absolute rights are most of the human rights. They can be limited or restricted. So let's have a look at this then. A care home takes a decision to have a blanket policy of replacing CCTV in the bedrooms of all residents for safety reasons. The outcome, they've said, this disappears with the right to respect for private life of all of the residents. Instead of doing that, what they could do is to make sure that only residents who pose a risk to themselves and or others will have CCTV placed in their rooms. So it's on case by case. That does mean that some of the people are having their rights taken away, but not all of them. So some residents have their right to respect for family life interfered with, but it's only due to their safety and the safety of others. Others will have their rights maintained. So if we have a look then, absolute rights are the right to life, the right not to be tortured or treated in an inhuman or degrading way, the right to freedom from slavery, and no punishment without law. Non-absolute rights, then, ones that can be changed, to be free from forced labour. That's non-absolute because very often if you go to prison you do have to carry out work. You guys are in school and have to do schoolwork, probably when you don't want to. The right to liberty is limited in case you get put in prison. The right to a fair trial, why that's non-absolute, I'm not entirely too sure. The right to respect for family life, we've already said. The right to freedom of thought, conscience and religion. It is okay, and the freedom of expression. You can have your own thoughts, you can think whatever you like. However, lots of people who say discriminatory comments, for example, if they say something racist or homophobic, they often back it up with, say, I've got the freedom of speech. The problem is the freedom of speech or freedom of thought and expression is a limited, non-absolute right. The right to not be discriminated against is far more important. So therefore, you can have your thoughts, you can believe what you want, but you cannot say things if it's going to discriminate against others. And therefore, when a lot of silly people use I've got freedom of speech as an excuse, they're actually completely wrong and misusing the concept of human rights. Freedom of assembly and association, there can be issues with that. So for example, some pressure groups have been banned, for example, so you're not allowed to be part of those. The right to marry and found a family, you can't get married until you're 16 without parental consent, and so on and so forth. The right to peaceful enjoyment of possessions, well, actually, if your possessions get taken by the police, you can't enjoy them. The right to education, people are excluded, unfortunately, and the right to free and fair elections, these can sometimes be stopped as well. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at some of those rights. We're going to name a right, describe what it means, and then give a possible example where this right might not be met. So if you draw yourself out a chart like the one on here, press pause, and then we'll start going through. So the first one, right to life, it's one of the most fundamental human rights. Public authorities can't take away anybody's life. However, there are some times when they can. They've also got to take reasonable steps to protect life, but here are some of the issues. What about protection from abuse? So if we know that somebody is the victim of domestic violence and we don't step in, and that person then dies, are we guilty of violating their human rights? Unfortunately, the answer is yes. Euthanasia. Euthanasia is where people who are suffering terminal illnesses choose to end their lives early. However, they're incapable of doing it themselves because they're too ill. So they ask a loved one to basically kill them before their time. It's illegal in this country. However, other countries do have it as legal, and you can argue for and against it. Do not resuscitate orders. Lots of people who go into hospital have a DNR, which is where if they lose consciousness, their heart stops, they stop breathing, they ask doctors not to resuscitate them. This obviously puts a huge burden on doctors and nurses because they are therefore allowing somebody to die who might not die otherwise. And then the provision of life-prolonging or saving treatment. There are some places in the country whose NHS trusts pay for better medicines than others do. So some people, for example, with cancer might get better care that might save their life in one area of the country compared to others. So think about those issues and what impact they have on the right to life. So, case study: a woman's discharged from mental health hospital before she felt ready. She's suicidal and anxious about delaying arranging a follow-up meeting. Her advocates used the right to life to argue her care and treatment was under a positive obligation to protect her life by ensuring she got support when needed, and therefore she was supplied with a support worker, and it increased to once a week. So these are ways that you can use human rights to make sure you're being provided for adequately. And there's an example of how to fill the chart in. The next one: prohibition of torture, inhuman or degrading treatment. So, how about severe neglect or abuse if somebody's being bullied and nobody does anything about it? How about if you don't protect others from abuse or harassment as well? Washing or dressing without regard to dignity. What if you're in hospital and you can't use the facilities by yourself? There's no nurse available to help you out. Excessive force used to restrain people, so issues to do with the police. Unsanitary conditions, lack of access to sanitary facilities. This could be to do with your housing. So, for example, if you do not have sanitary conditions in your housing and your landlord or the council do not provide it. And again, poor conditions within publicly owned institutes. So another case study, press pause and have a read of it. And the next one, right to liberty. It's not a right to do whatever you want. Some people do interpret it that way. It just means you've got the right not to be locked in a cell or a room. It's a limited right, and obviously if you're in prison you cannot have that right. And again, another case study, press pause and have a read. Okay, right to respect for private and family life, home and correspondence. So this covers personal ties of a family kind. So basically it's about things like privacy, personal choices, relationships, mental well-being, and so on and so forth. And we're talking about phone calls, letters, faxes and emails. It's a qualified right. Again, it can be limited, unrestricted. For example, if the police need to look through your records. And a case study is here again. Press pause and have a look. This one's really sweet. Okay, the right not to be discriminated against then. Discrimination on a range of grounds, including, but there are more, your sex, race, colour, language, religion, political opinion, national or social origin, association with a national minority, property, so whether you own your home or not, birth, disability, age, sexual orientation, marital status, illegitimacy means whether you were born with parents being married or not, and trade union membership, and transsexual status, or if you are in prison. So discrimination under Article 18 occurs when someone is treated in a different manner compared with others in a similar situation, or where a person with different needs is treated in the same way, regardless of those needs. I'm quite sure you can all give stories of when discrimination has happened. Okay, what you need to do now, have a look at these case studies, try and work out what right they're not having met, and come up with an action plan of what they can do. So story 1, Press pause and have a go. Try and work out what human right they're not having met and try and work out what they could do. Again, story 2, press pause, work out what right they're not having met and try and come up with an action plan of what they should do. Story 3, press pause, try and work out what human right they're not having met and an action plan of what they can do. And the same with story 4, press pause. And the same with story 5, press pause. Okay, there is one more question on the screen. Have a go at answering it. And the answer was C. Don't worry about this one. So what do you think then? Can all rights be met all of the time? Answer in a paragraph and give some evidence. And then we've got an 8-mark question. Universal human rights are not protected effectively. You've got to examine the case for or against this statement. So you'll argue completely for with a little bit against and a detailed conclusion, or completely against with a little bit for, again with a justified conclusion. So arguments you could put in: yes, human rights are protected effectively. Talk about all the things we know that are in place: the UDHR, ECHR, HRA. All of our human rights are criminally protected. It's all in the legal and justice system, so you can argue all of that. No, you could argue, well, what about places like China and Russia? There are human rights violations that are led by the state, and we don't take them to the International Criminal Court. So you argue yes, you argue no. You can also give some of the examples from the UK and a justified conclusion with your decision. And there's your mark scheme.